Hi, welcome to the Canadian City and Southern Railroad. Today I'm going to talk about switches, track switches that is, not turnouts, well, turnouts. I have here 4 pieces of micro-engineering code 55 weathered rail. On these 2 pieces I've filed 2 points. I've also cleaned off the bottom of them so that they can solder better. They don't solder very well against the weathering. These 2 pieces are going to be the wing rails of a stub switch. I've cut a notch here and here, about just under a foot in and exactly 6 feet in from the end on both of these. Those are the components I'll need, the only components I'll need to build the frog portion of a stub switch. This is my switch building pattern. I call it a pattern because it's not necessarily a jig. I did it by drawing a straight line and then measuring 6 units, in this case O-scale feet, over, and then coming up 1 foot. That's what determines that it's a number 6 frog. All the frogs on my layout are number 6s, whether they're standard gauge, dual gauge, code 70, code 55, whatever. They're all number 6s. These lines are not gauged. Instead, they're center lines based on a piece of code 70 flex track, dual gauge. The reason they're center lines is that way I could make code 55 or code 70 on the same pattern. Using my pattern as a guide, I have bent the 2 wing rails and their little tips to fit the lines on the pattern, and then I've taped everything down, turning the pattern into a jig. Now I could do this any place where the number 6 lines cross. I'm doing it over here because this one's the least scorched. Now I've put a small amount of soldering paste between the 2 point rails and on a little thin piece of brass, very thin piece of brass that I cut with just simple scissors, and smeared that around on that very sparingly. Now all I need to do is apply the heat and the solder. And that's it. I now have a number 6 code 55 weathered frog. The freezer tape has been removed, things have cooled down, and the excess brass has been trimmed off from the bottom of the frog. And as long as these rails are in alignment, everything should work just fine. Now, the 2, what would be point rails, but this is a stub switch, I can bend these either way, making this a left or a right hand switch on the wing rails, and on the point rails they can be trimmed off to wherever I want the insulation gap so that when the polarity changes to the frog, it doesn't short out the railroad. So this one's now ready to be spiked down to the layout. But I'll put it away for later because I still have others. Now over to the layout. All of the track work and all of the wiring is now in for section 2. The fascia's all been finished, and I'm ready to start adding scenery. So let's talk about some of the things that I have done. And we'll start with explaining the switches and their controllers. This is a number 6 code 55 stub switch. Basically just like the one I just soldered over at the bench. It's the lead to the stamp mill collection track. It's controlled by a micro servo with a micro switch to control the polarity to the frog. The only insulation gaps necessary are here and here because it's a stub switch, the points are actually already insulated. To control all the switches, 4 of them, on section 2, by the way, I say switches, not turnouts. To control them all, I've used simple, inexpensive servo controllers. They work well and they're easy to install. To install them, I simply removed them from the little plastic wrapper and mounted them on some little plates I made out of extra thin plywood, painted to match the fascia board. They work really well. You can center them and you can vary the speed by which the switches throw simply by how fast you turn the little knob. I have set them up on this section so that to the left is always the closed position on the switch and to the right is the thrown position. Just like you saw just a moment ago when I showed the close-up of this little switch to the mill lead. The next switch on this section is a full dual gauge switch. You'll notice that it has 2 standard frogs and 1 somewhat unusual frog, which allow the various rails to cross at the correct place according to the pattern on my little board. It has to be gapped here so that when the 2 main frogs change polarity, it doesn't short it out. Now, since this section is always rail A on my layout, which is the red wire on my bus, it does not need to change polarity, so therefore it does not need to be isolated from the rest of the layout. But these 3 rails do have to have insulation gaps for when the polarity changes to this section of the switch. There's a micro switch down next to the servo that controls the motion, and that had to be positioned in such a way that when it clicks, the rails are not touching. Otherwise, it would put a temporary short in the layout as the switch points move. The next switch on section 2 is a dual to narrow gauge switch. And because the two rails are close together on this side, it only requires a single frog, which is just basically just like any other number 6 switch with a code 70 rail. It's a point switch because this is an area where there will be full-size standard gauge passenger cars, so I didn't want to use stub switches in this section. This is the third type of switch on this section of the railroad, and it's a standard gauge to dual gauge switch. Now it has one standard frog and one of those tricky frogs. If it had been the other way, if the third rail had been on this side, then it would only require 2 regular frogs. So this is 3 of the 4 possible ways you can combine standard to narrow and narrow to dual, and etc. Now it's time to run a track inspection train. caboose number 2 is a very short car. Combine number 7 is a long car. So running them in combination lets me know how my track is turning out. The two dual gauge switches don't even have their guardrails yet. If they weren't lined up properly, there's no reason to have the guardrails as yet, and that lets me know if they're okay. This area down in here where the log pond is, that's going to be also my programming track area. Little dirty track. Well, thanks for watching, and have a really great rest of your day. And I guess I'm off to the lumber yard to get some more wood for sections 3, 4, and 5.